Hello and welcome to the effects of CAFOs on environmental justice. My name is Chandler Randall and I'm the manager of educational programs here at the Environmental Law Institute, and I am so delighted to welcome everyone to today's webinar. ELI is proud to offer programming on cutting edge issues in environmental law and policy, and it really is such an honor to have you all join us today for this special program. At the end of today's webinar, we will have time for a Q&A session, so please submit your questions through GoTo's question box, and please do not wait until the end. Send us your questions as soon as you think of them. I would also like to thank our outstanding panelists for joining us today to lend their expertise to this webinar. While they will be introduced briefly, the full speaker bios are posted on our website, eli.org, and I strongly encourage you to check out their expertise and experience in more detail there. But as we begin, I would like to briefly introduce today's moderator, Molly Brown. Molly is a senior attorney and director of community legal education for the Chesapeake Legal Alliance. Molly has developed and implemented CLA's community legal education program, where she uses her passion as an environmental lawyer, educator, and facilitator to empower communities to utilize the law and create enduring change at a local level. Molly brings to CLA her previous environmental and land use litigation experience and understanding of local and global sustainability issues. Molly, we are so thankful to have you here with us today. And with that, I will turn things over to our amazing moderator, Molly Brown. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Chandler, and welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you could join us this afternoon for what I know is going to be an amazing discussion. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce you all to our panelists for today. First, I'd like to introduce Alexis Andaman, who is a senior attorney with Earth Justice's Sustainable Food and Farming Program. Alexis has her JD with honors and a certificate in environmental and natural resources law from Lewis and Clark Law School. She's also completed fellowships with the Conservation Law Center/Clinic at Indiana University's Moore School of Law and the Center for Biological Diversity. Next, I'd like to introduce Kelly Hunter Foster, who's a senior attorney with Waterkeeper Alliance. Kelly has more than 20 years of regulatory and litigation experience with all of the major federal and many state environmental laws, including administrative, civil, and criminal cases in both state and federal courts. She's been with Waterkeeper Alliance since 2010 and currently manages that organization's water defense and National Pure Farms, Pure Waters campaigns. And last, although certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Sherry White Williamson. Sherry is the Environmental Justice Policy Director with the North Carolina Conservation Network. In that role, she leads the organization's efforts to connect impacted community-led campaigns and organizations with decision makers. She is also co-founder of the Environmental Justice Community Action Network in Clinton, North Carolina. Prior to joining the North Carolina Conservation Network, Sherry worked at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in the Office of Environmental Justice. As Chandler referred to earlier, the plan for today is going to start off with our panel providing you with an overview of what their work and experience regarding CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations, is, as well as the environmental harm that those CAFOs can cause to the communities and broader areas in which they are located, and how those harms disproportionately impact communities of color and high poverty locations. After that, we're going to present our panelists with some questions for a roundtable discussion, both those that we have prepared ahead of time, as well as those from the audience. As Chandler requested, if you have any questions that come up, please feel free to enter them into the chat as we go. We'd like to keep the panel conversation as interactive as we possibly can on this platform. So we'll try to answer questions as we go, and we'll get to any that we didn't answer in real time, hopefully by the end of our time together today. So with that introduction, I am going to hand it over to Alexis. Alexis, would you start us off, please?
Sure, thanks Molly, and thanks to ELI for organizing this great panel, and to all of you for joining us. I'm so pleased to be able to be part of this conversation along with such great co-panelists. I imagine that folks joining are coming with a range of experiences relating to CAFOs and environmental justice. So I'd like to begin by sharing a very brief introduction to the topic. Meat, dairy, and egg production in the United States today looks very different than it did just 40 years ago. While most animals were once raised on small, diversified, and independent farms, they are now primarily produced in massive industrial concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, which can hold many hundreds or thousands of animals and over 1 million birds in close confinement. I'll share an example to illustrate the transformation that has occurred over time. In 1987, only 8% of pigs were raised in facilities with 5,000 or more animals. By 2017, that percentage had increased ninefold. 73% of pigs were raised in facilities with 5,000 or more animals. By and large, environmental regulation in the US has not kept pace with this regulation, leaving many CAFOs largely unregulated. And without adequate regulation, CAFOs cause a tremendous amount of pollution that harms humans, wildlife, and the environment, and leads to the environmental injustices that we're talking about today. Because they confine so many animals, CAFOs generate a tremendous amount of urine, feces, and other waste. In fact, a single CAFO can generate more waste than an entire human city. According to the US Department of Agriculture, in 2012, the largest CAFOs alone generated 404 million tons of manure. That's over 20 times the amount of fecal wet mass produced by human beings in the United States. Unlike human waste, however, CAFO waste generally is not treated or disinfected prior to disposal. And I'll note here that different CAFOs deal with waste in different ways. I'll focus on wet manure management, which typically involves the storage of manure in liquid form in vast pits or tanks and disposal on fields nearby. CAFO waste usually contains pollutants such as nitrogen and phosphorus, disease-causing pathogens, salt, heavy metals, trace elements, pharmaceuticals, antibiotics, pesticides, and hormones. These pollutants enter the environment because waste storage pits can breach, fail, or overflow. Waste can seep through the bottom of storage pits into groundwater and wash off fields into rivers and streams, and also leach into the groundwater from fields. Once CAFO waste enters the water, it can contaminate drinking water supplies, which poses serious threats to human health. Exposure to CAFO pollutants in drinking water can cause a range of health problems, including increased risk for hyperthyroidism, insulin-dependent diabetes, birth defects, and in infants under 6 months of age, a potentially fatal condition known as blue baby syndrome. As a result, many people living near CAFOs have chosen or been instructed to stop drinking well water. And some people choose to rely entirely on bottled water, which poses a significant expense. CAFOs also emit air pollution, including hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and hundreds of volatile organic compounds. Exposure to those pollutants can cause nausea, headaches, dizziness, runny nose, scratchy throat, burning eyes, coughing, wheezing, and shortness of breath, even among people who live miles away from the nearest CAFO. One recent study found that ammonia emissions associated with manure management at CAFOs cause at least 6,900 deaths every year. Air pollutants from CAFOs smell terrible, and exposure to those odors over time can cause psychological harm. CAFO neighbors regularly subjected to livestock odors experience significantly higher rates of tension, depression, anger, confusion, and fatigue as compared with otherwise similar people who live farther away from CAFOs. And those psychological harms are concerning not only in their own right, but also because mood has been shown to play a role in immunity. So those problems with mood can affect subsequent disease. In addition to threatening human health, CAFO pollutants also harm wildlife. For instance, water pollution from CAFOs can fuel hazardous algal blooms that endanger fish, animals, and other living things, prevent people from enjoying local water bodies, and damage local economies. Both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration have expressly identified water pollution from CAFOs as a threat to certain threatened and endangered species. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I do think it's important to note that in addition to releasing air and water pollution, CAFOs harbor and spread dangerous pathogens. They also contribute to climate change, and they're extremely vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Pollution from CAFOs disproportionately harms people of color and environmental justice communities across the country. For example, according to a recent analysis, in North Carolina, the percent of Black people living within 3 miles of a large paid CAFO is nearly 1.5 times higher than the percent of non-Hispanic white people. That means that if all races and ethnicities in North Carolina were exposed to large paid CAFOs at the same rate, approximately 53,000 fewer Black people would live within 3 miles of a large paid CAFO in North Carolina. And that 3-mile distance is significant because within 3 miles, you see health effects resulting from exposure to air pollution and water pollution. Similar patterns exist with respect to environmental justices in California's Central Valley, which is a major dairy producing part of the country. And even in Iowa, where CAFOs are tightly clustered throughout the state, and you don't see the same demographics as you do in North Carolina and California, CAFOs cause disproportionate harm to elderly people living far away from grocery stores, physicians, and hospitals. And I'll close these introductory points with just a little bit more detail on one aspect of the underregulation problem. EPA admits that CAFOs discharge water pollution, that many CAFOs discharge water pollution without permits issued under the Clean Water Act, which is a violation of federal law. In fact, even though EPA estimates that there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 21,000 CAFOs across the country, fewer than 7,000 of those CAFOs actually have Clean Water Act permits. The majority of CAFOs lack water pollution permits altogether or operate under state laws and permits that, as compared with Clean Water Act permits, are less protective of water quality, offer less transparency, and provide fewer opportunities for public participation. And all of those aspects compound the environmental injustices that CAFOs cause. This is a problem with respect to the Clean Water Act and also with respect to EPA's implementation of executive orders directing it to advance environmental justice. So with that, I'll turn it back to Molly.
Thank you so much, Alexis. Kelly, would you share next, please?
Sure. What an excellent overview of the issues that Alexis just provided. My name's Kelly Hunter Foster. I have been working on CAFO issues since approximately 1997. First in the Office of Attorney General in Oklahoma, which has dairy, poultry, and swine CAFOs throughout the state. There was an influx starting in the mid-90s and an effort to try to start addressing the pollution associated with those industries, prevent it, that took place at that time, and some state laws were generated that were fairly decent. And so we got engaged on those types of issues very early on and continued to work on those up through, in Oklahoma, up through 2010. In particular, doing litigation associated with the poultry industry for out-of-state, primarily out-of-state pollution from Arkansas that's flowing into the state of Oklahoma. When I left there, I went to Waterkeeper Alliance, and they have a Pure Farms, Pure Waters campaign that is national in scope, very active in North Carolina. And so I worked in North Carolina on both swine and poultry issues there. The swine issues have been present for a very long time, causing incredible impacts to the people who live around them that, you know, when you hear their stories, it will break your heart, literally. And so water keepers there are trying their best to, you know, monitor for, document, and do something about those adverse impacts. And they've been doing so for a long time. So we can talk a little bit more about that. And then I also have worked on these issues in other parts of the country that maybe, don't get as much attention. But CAFO pollution is present in almost every state. That's one of the primary reasons that we have a national nutrient pollution crisis, increasing frequency of harmful algal blooms in waters. Harmful algal blooms are toxins that are produced by algae that, is formed after excessive loading of nitrogen and phosphorus into the watersheds. It happens in coastal waters, it happens in rivers, it happens in lakes, and it is, very often associated with CAFO agriculture because they are enormous sources of unregulated nitrogen and phosphorus discharges into the country's water. So we see those kinds of problems. I have particularly worked on those kinds of problems in the Chesapeake Bay region, in New York, in Lake Erie in Ohio, which had a massive toxic algal bloom associated with CAFO pollution. Idaho, Washington State, California, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Missouri. I mean, it is everywhere and it is significant. And I think one of the things, beyond just the fact that it disproportionately impacts low income and minority communities is the fact that in many places, I would say nationally adequate authority exists under the Clean Water Act to control this pollution. And it's not being utilized. In many states, adequate authority exists to control that pollution, but it's not being utilized. And so the question is, why is that? There are some, case law barriers to regulation happening to the full extent that I think a lot of us would like to see. But in my opinion, it's the lack of political will. So, at the EPA years ago, they were supposed to do an information collection request just to identify where all the CAFOs are and how many animals they have and how they're managing their pollution. And there was so much political pressure brought to bear that they backed out of it. They withdrew it. Just information collection. So that's the barrier that we're up against, is the influence of the industry and their ability to stop meaningful controls on their pollution. And so I'll just give you this one example since we're talking about disparate impacts in particular today. In Oklahoma, the poultry industry is concentrated along the eastern border of the state. And so pollution flows in from Arkansas into Oklahoma, into very rural communities, into areas within the boundaries of tribal nations. And while there was this initial rush to address those sources of pollution that were coming across the border, those are not active today. There was efforts at the federal level and at the state level to try to deal with it, and those things have flagged, and things have gotten worse, not better, since then. In fact, I was thinking about this before I joined today. The only time that an effort to address the pollution on a watershed scale has been effective in Oklahoma is when it impacted the city of Tulsa's drinking water supply. So a large major city was able to get reductions in the pollution sources and limits on land application, et cetera. But when it comes to all of the other people that are impacted and all the other drinking water supplies, despite a lot of efforts, those have not been successful to date. So I'll stop there. I look forward to answering more questions and talking about this more.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that information. Sherry, would you please share next?
Sure. Thanks, Molly. And it's a pleasure to be on the panel today. I want to talk a little bit about what I do at the Conservation Network, and then I want to talk a little bit about living in an impacted community because that's where I live. At the Conservation Network, my role is to try and connect community members with decision makers, to try and help affect change at the state level on legislative issues, to keep communities informed about what is going on so that they can advocate for themselves, because too often the most impacted communities are the communities that have the least power or least access to decision makers, and as a result of that are not able to influence many of the decisions that are made at the state level that directly impacts them over time. We're also working to try and hold community meetings across the state, working with DEQ to do a better job of education of communities. One of the challenges we have in North Carolina, which is where I am, and thanks to both of the previous speakers for talking about my state, because I want to talk about it a lot more about what's happening here. Trying to allow opportunities for community members to come out and to find out what's going on, but being sensitive to the fact that most of these communities are working communities, and so we have to use a different type of business model in terms of working with them outside of regular business hours, evening meetings, Saturday meetings, meetings in different locations than you would normally think of, where communities would be comfortable participating in various activities and just coming out to learn. So from a state level and an organization that represents over 60 other organizations, that's my role with Conservation Network, to sort of be that lead on environmental justice issues and environmental justice policy there. Living in a rural community, I just want to tell you a little bit about that community, which I think will help to really set the stage. I know this is about CAFOs, but if you find CAFOs in a community, you find a lot of other polluting sources in that same community. It's almost as if everything gets attracted to that community. So here in Sampson County, we are the second largest hog producer in the United States. We are the #1 turkey producer in the state, and the state is #2 in turkey production in the United States. We have an in vivo wood pellet processing factory here, which means we're suffering from deforestation because most of that product is going overseas to Europe. We have the largest landfill in the state in a predominantly African-American community. That landfill is in excess of 1,300 acres now and has been extended for another 10 years. We receive trash from all over the state and outside of the state at that landfill, including PFAS and many of the other contaminants that are of concern to Americans across the United States right now. We also have 2 biogas processing facilities in a small community, and those 2 facilities are less than a mile apart, each of them proposing to create biogas in 2 different ways. Most of the residents in the county are on well water, which creates another problem because, as both of the previous guests have said, many of these residents are no more than 3 miles from a CAFO. And so as a result, we have been conducting water testing here and are finding contaminants in the water, such as arsenic and nitrate and lead, and many of the contaminants that we have some major concerns about. Alexis mentioned the lagoon and spray field system, which is a problem here. And she didn't quite describe the lagoon the way I would. So for anyone on this call, if you can imagine a supersized swimming pool, maybe 2 or 3 times the size of a normal swimming pool, with nothing but animal feces and waste in it that's left there to decompose over time, that's what the community is faced with. And then the effluent or the liquid from that lagoon is sprayed on adjoining fields. And many of the farmers here see that as natural fertilizer, where they then grow their vegetables and label those vegetables as organic vegetables. So those are many of the problems that we face. And not only is it a problem spraying the field, but oftentimes the field is oversprayed, so that you not only have a problem with the field itself, but then it ends up getting in local streams, and you see the algal blooms, and you see the problems with local communities who are having contamination in their well water. We found total coliform, which indicates that even fecal matter is getting into some of these residential well systems. So there are a lot of problems related to that. There's been a lot of research on CAFOs, so we know that there's a lot of information out there that policymakers are basically ignoring in making the many decisions that they make regarding the type of permitting that is or isn't allowed or promoted. Poultry in the state is not regulated, so there is no way to know where poultry farms are in the state other than someone recognizes where there are efforts. Even to have something as simple as a waste management plan electronically filed with a state authority have failed at the legislative level. So we're seeing a huge proliferation of poultry farms in southeastern North Carolina, along with all of the swine farms that are located. And the 3 counties where we're seeing the largest proliferation are Duplin, which is the #1 hog producer, Sampson, as I said, which is the #2 hog producer and the #1 turkey producer, and Robeson County, which has a huge Native American population and is the #1 county that we're seeing such a huge proliferation of poultry farms, along with having the largest poultry processing plant in that county as well. Those are just a few of the concerns that we have here. Other problems here, as I indicated earlier, are a lack of regulation or lax regulation. For swine here, we have general permits, which don't require necessarily any additional requirements for excess monitoring. The state refuses to monitor air or water around these CAFO operations because of the power of big ag in the state and the ability to influence legislation at the state level and even at the federal level. Cumulative impacts, which is something we haven't talked about, is not considered in the permitting process. And you can't issue an air permit without considering all of the other exposures that members of these various communities are getting when those decisions are being made. There were nuisance lawsuits filed in North Carolina in 2015. Smithfield was not successful in those lawsuits. They agreed to settle, but once the nuisance lawsuits were filed, the General Assembly passed a law basically that will prevent anyone in the future from filing a nuisance lawsuit against any of these CAFO operations. So there's another problem that communities face in trying to combat what they're having to deal with every day. And finally, I think there is just generally a huge lack of understanding, or perhaps even a dereliction of duty of trying to understand what's happening in impacted communities and trying to make some changes in those communities. And with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to answering any questions at this point.
Fantastic. I am going to start the panel off with some questions about specifically about the environmental and health harms that CAFOs cause to the disproportionately impacted communities in which they are situated. But before we do that, Sherry, as a resident of a community in which there are CAFOs, would you set a little bit of context for us as to how they affect quality of life? So, you know, you talk about nuisance lawsuits. What does that mean? Why were they brought? Before we get into like the specific environmental and health impacts, what does it mean to just your everyday life?
The nuisance lawsuits were brought because of the number of CAFOs and the locations within the county or within the state. Many residents were experiencing excessive odors as a result of their location close to these hog operations. They were not able to enjoy their backyards. They couldn't have barbecues. They were bombarded with flies. They could no longer wash their clothes on the clothesline because the clothes were more likely to come in spotted again because of the result of the spray field system. The spray fields are so close to many of the homes that the hog waste would end up on the clothes. So it was very difficult for residents living near these operations. If depending on how close they live, they may have truck traffic going 24/7, dropping off hogs, dropping off food, picking up hogs, picking up dead animals. During the flood, there were dead animals literally floating in water. I'm sure some of the folks on this discussion have seen those pictures, and those animals are stored in basically a huge dumpster. And so periodically what we call a dead truck would come by and pick up those dead animals and take them to some place to be disposed, either burned or dropped off at a landfill like the one we have here in Sampson County. So the intent of the nuisance lawsuits was to give some relief to the 500 or so complainants who filed those 26 separate lawsuits. There were 4 lawsuits that were settled, all huge sums of money in favor of the complainants and not the industry. That was then taken to the 4th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. The industry lost at that level, at which point they agreed to settle the additional lawsuits. But as I said, as soon as those lawsuits were filed, the North Carolina General Assembly passed a law that prevents anyone from filing a lawsuit if it is outside of within a year of the time that one of those CAFOs is built. And all of the CAFOs, except for the poultry CAFOs that are going up now, were at least in place for 20 years because there's been a moratorium on CAFOs here in North Carolina for some time. So that pretty much prevents in the future anyone from being able to file a nuisance lawsuit. There are some challenges now to those laws, but it doesn't appear that the communities will prevail in the courts.
Thank you very much. Kelly and Alexis, I know that you both have worked closely with communities affected by CAFOs. Do you have anything to add to the greater context before I dive into the environmental harms?
There's not much to add to what Sherry said. I think she put it excellently. One thing to note is Sherry mentioned that there's a lot of research on the harms that CAFOs cause, and that's absolutely true. I think really important to remember that people have known for decades that CAFOs make people sick. In 1998, workshops with experts convened by EPA and convened by the CDC recognized that exposure to CAFO air pollution makes people sick. So this isn't new emerging information. This is incredibly well-established science that, as everyone has mentioned already, regulators are largely choosing to ignore.
And one common thing that I see when people are newly confronted with, an influx of new CAFOs is that first, they don't know they're coming. They don't get notice that they're coming a lot of times when they should. And they're not provided any process that allows them to challenge or present concerns. I've seen them come in and be right next to schools and churches. Communities get upset a lot of times. A lot of times they try to organize and they are shocked to find out that the government is not there for them, that they're not providing accurate information about the risks. I've seen governments say they don't have authority that I know they do have to respond to the pollution, and people get really angry. and they try to do something about it, and there aren't as many options as there should be for them to push back. And then, responding to it, having to find a way to pay for water quality monitoring, to sample your well, to sample a stream, that's a burden that is often not being borne by the regulatory agencies that should be charged with doing that monitoring, which also have limited resources. But community members are out there trying to figure out, how do we monitor? What do we monitor for? Where do we monitor? What do we do if we find something? And oftentimes when they find something, there's nothing that the regulators are willing to do either. And so that's a common theme throughout the country that I have seen. And I hope that we find some ways to challenge that and change it, because it's really important.
Maybe we'll walk away today with some ideas.
That'd be great.
Alexis, would you start us off? I know that you spoke about this briefly in your introduction. Would you start us off talking a little bit more about the environmental harms that CAFOs bring to the communities in which they're in?
Sure. As I mentioned, CAFOs cause air and water pollution. They generate and spread dangerous pathogens. They contribute to climate change. As Sherry mentioned, they, bring with them other sources of pollution, like near constant truck traffic and emissions associated with that, not to mention the annoyance. Maybe it's helpful to talk a little bit more about pathogens. Because CAFOs raise huge numbers of animals in close confinement, there is a huge risk of disease. And many CAFO operators choose to keep animals on low levels of antibiotics for disease prevention. That applies even to healthy animals. And that pattern of antibiotic use also helps with growth promotion. So it has other benefits for CAFO operators. The problem is that consistent exposure to low levels of antibiotics breeds antibiotic-resistant genes and antibiotic-resistant bacteria that then leave the CAFO and affect people living nearby. There are plenty of studies showing that harm and showing specifically that CAFO workers, for example, carry antibiotic-resistant bacteria and spread it when they go home to their own children who are not spending time in CAFOs. So that is an example of another harm from this operating model that is affecting community members.
I guess it's a little bit silly to be splitting up the environmental harms from the health harms because they're so directly related. Kelly and Sherry, do you have any specific environmental harms that lead to health issues in communities that have not been discussed already that you'd like to talk about?
Well, the emissions from the lagoons, for example, have been shown to affect or increase the prevalence of asthma, particularly in younger children, other folks who have respiratory conditions. Dr. Steve Wing, who was an epidemiologist at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, did a lot of the early work on the relationship between proximity to CAFOs and different types of illnesses, and was able to connect high rates of diabetes, hypertension, stress, you name it. It's pretty easy to show a connection, and Alexis talked about the bacteria that is oftentimes taken home by the workers to the family. There was a study done and they went into individual homes and swabbed appliances, swabbed children's toys, and found this bacteria on pretty much anything in the home of that worker, once they went home, although they thought they were, pretty clean going home. This bacteria is pretty insidious and showed up in all kinds of places. I think while COVID was not the best thing to happen to us, COVID opened a huge window for a lot of folks to be able to see the relationship and understand the impacts of disease in many of these households, particularly households that may be Hispanic, because many of them were multi-generational. And so you saw a rate of disease in many of those homes that you would not have seen otherwise, but then that also sort of opened the window for you to see all of the other problems associated with being exposed to both the water and the air and the soil in communities that had these CAFOs. Part of the problem too with many of these things is that while Dr. Wing did a lot of research, and there's a lot of other research from a very local level for local communities, there's not a lot of local research, so that we don't know what's happening in those individual communities. Whereas when we go to talk to decision makers and try to explain the problem and take community members to explain the problem, the response generally is, well, we've seen the data from the industry and everything looks fine to us. So one of the challenges moving forward is to get more of that community level data that can be used to make the case for what needs to be done to show the relationship between where these communities live and the impacts that these industries have on their quality of life.
Kelly, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, a little bit. So one of the problems with regulation, and there are several, is that when we're thinking about land application and the limits on land application, there are not meaningful requirements in place that I'm aware of that control pathogen pollution. So, you know, it's manure, it's sewage, animal sewage, basically, you know, that's being spread on fields next to ditches and underlain by these things called tile drains, you know, next to water courses, usually. And, you know, this pathogen pollution gets in the surface waters next to it. And, you know, nationally, just like nutrient pollution, pathogen pollution is a huge problem in recreational waters. And it is, you know, something that can be incredibly dangerous because of the antimicrobial, because of the antibiotics that are fed to livestock in confinement in particular. You know, it can lead to antibiotic resistant bacteria. So when all these pathogens come in from multiple land application fields into singular water bodies and mix together, you also get them from septic systems and cattle and things like this, and they all mix together and make this sort of toxic stew that, you know, makes it kind of incredibly challenging to know where it came from. So that feeds into what Sherry said about community information. You know, there is, first of all, the need for treating the waste to address the pathogens in the first place, because we know it will run off. It will make it to the water. And then the second part is, you know, these giant facilities should have to monitor their releases and report them, the groundwater and the surface water, and that's not being required. And so that, again, that not only is the pollution burden being borne by the communities, it's also the cost of trying to figure out what's happening to them in a very complex system.
I'll add to that it's not just the discharges directly into the groundwater, but Sherry mentioned ammonia before. So you have air pollution that, you know, it influences the health or the quality of the air that we're breathing, but it also deposits into the water sources that these communities are relying on. So it's coming from all different sources. Do you have any ideas about what resources the communities need in order to do any sort of, so understanding that putting the burden on communities is not the answer, right? It's not what we want. But if we can't force the industry to do it, and we would like to know what is in the water and where it is coming from. What resources do local communities need in order to do just that?
They need access to experts. They need access to a lab that will do their testing. They need the money to be able to pay for the lab costs.
Yep.
They need volunteers that are trained to be able to take the samples. But one of the challenges, in my opinion, is, that community members don't have the time to go out and do this all the time.
Mhm.
And, they'll start and they'll be very committed. And at some point, they have other things that they have to take care of. They have the same concerns, they need the same information. But, I think a lot of times when people go into thinking about monitoring for this type of pollution, they think, well, let's just go out and get a couple of samples and see if it's there. It'll be there.
Mhm.
You need much more than that to be able to have a lot of the information that you need to do something about it. And so it's a long-term commitment. And it's very challenging. Water keepers do it, and they could do it more, with more resources, but they can't do it everywhere. And so, we've tried to, when people request it, go out and do training and help them develop monitoring systems and support that monitoring. I want to do more of that and then find grants to support it. But, I think the need to do it long term makes it really challenging for communities to be able to, do it themselves.
I would agree
Alexis
with,
or
oh,
Sherry,
sorry.
do you have anything to add?
I would agree with Kelly. One of the keys are the experts. And I think one of the untapped resources that communities should try to tap into if they are close to them are academic institutions. Graduate students are a great resource, oftentimes looking for projects and on specific kinds of things, are under the supervision of a professor or dean or someone who has the kind of expertise. At least in our situation in Sampson County, we've been able to tap into a couple of the universities who are interested in working on some of these issues. So working more closely with those kinds of institutions could potentially provide some assistance to communities. Money is huge. Time is huge, because this is not the only problem that many of these communities are facing. So we can't expect them to be able to allocate the kind of time that they need to allocate. I feel strongly that there needs to be a lot of education, but I think that one of the other untapped resources may be the faith-based community, because in many of these communities, there is a direct link between the community and a church or a pastor somewhere. So that might be another way to at least start the process of engaging communities and sharing the kind of information. Because if you live in a community that's dependent on CAFOs, it's oftentimes hard to get the attention of the community if they're also dependent on that particular industry for their household income. So there are a number of challenges that we have to consider as we are trying to think strategically and creatively about how to engage the community in a way that would be meaningful for them, but would also provide the resources that they need to be able to do the kind of monitoring that needs to happen in these communities.
Kelly and Sherry have raised great points, and it's true that so many people living near CAFOs have been tremendously creative and persistent. I think it's important to note that if existing laws were properly enforced, community members would have much more access to information. So for example, as I mentioned, any CAFO that's discharging water pollution needs a permit to do that issued under the water. And Clean Water Act permits include a lot of protections for people living nearby. A Clean Water Act permit is made available for public comment. There's an opportunity for a public hearing. CAFOs that have Clean Water Act permits are required to develop nutrient management plans, which are basically worksheets where a CAFO operator figures out how much manure they're going to generate and comes up with a plan for how they're going to deal with that manure, with the goal of eliminating discharges. There are executive orders that require EPA to collect data on environmental justice problems and take action to address those problems and make sure that enforcement actions are taking place in places where pollution is causing an environmental justice issue, as is so clearly the case with CAFOs. So there are all of these creative approaches which are absolutely necessary because there's a failure of enforcement. And certainly the existing laws don't go far enough, but there is a lot that could be done just by looking to the authorities that exist and actually taking action to implement and enforce them.
Great. Thank you all so much. I'm going to take it from a community focus to a national focused question now. So we've spoken a lot about North Carolina this afternoon, and Kelly, you introduced some other areas of the country in your opening remarks. Would you talk to us, would the panel talk to us about the trends we're seeing with CAFO development nationwide? So we've talked about California a little bit. What are we seeing in what parts of the country? Is there evidence that what we're seeing in North Carolina is actually evidence of a broader problem, an environmental justice problem?
Absolutely. I mean, it's those same things are happening at various scales across the country, in almost every state in the country. The types of pollution are different. So, for example, in Washington State, there's the Yakima Valley, the Yakima County, an area of heavy dairy concentration. It has, they use lagoons and spray fields with that industry as well. They're not new, but over the period of record that we've talked about, many have gone out of business, others have increased in size, etc. They are documented to have in that county a higher proportion of low income and indigenous people, people of color, and tribal members. The groundwater is documented to be contaminated by high levels of nitrate. People in that region are having to spend their own money to buy their own bottled water. It's been incredibly difficult and taken a lot of effort by a lot of different people to try to get the state to implement basic requirements of the Clean Water Act into their permitting system. A group of us joined together and challenged that permit, and it took years. And we just finally got it overturned. It was already time for the next permit by the time we got the first one overturned. But we did establish great precedent. But it's frustrating, I think, especially for the people that live there who, do not feel seen, heard, or listened to. They do not feel like that, something very serious, their drinking water is polluted to the point that they cannot consume it. Very high levels of nitrate. And the state is resisting doing anything that would really meaningfully change that. So much so that they, in this permit that we ended up challenging, it was made less stringent than the previous iteration of it, in the sense that, the dairy industry is, I've seen it in two places, New York and in Washington State, the dairy industry wanting to have their nutrient management plan, the plan that controls how their facility is run and how they manage their waste, secret, not available to the public, not even reviewed by the agency before they get their permit. So they, We got that stopped in New York. Now we've gotten it stopped in Washington State. I expect to see it in other places. There is precedent in those two places now that's not consistent with the Clean Water Act. But I think for the people that live there who are, getting ready to work on this new permit, it's hard to think that the agency that's supposed to be controlling this pollution will do its job when what's required when even the basic requirements of the permit that is required under federal law are not being implemented, or they're being pushed back against. And the basic things that everyone knows will stop a lot of the pollution are not being required, like a lagoon liner, like a liner.
Mhm.
I mean, that's a thing that people do with CAFOs and other places.
For those of us on the call who aren't familiar with what a lagoon liner is, would you just briefly explain that?
Yeah. So, most other, if not all, other industrial pits, ponds, lagoons, whatever you want to call them, are not constructed in dirt, directly in dirt. So we're not digging a hole out and then dumping the waste in there, because it's rather obvious that allows the waste to migrate through the soil into groundwater. I have seen groundwater contaminate. So I want to go back to North Carolina really quickly, but I want to say what a lagoon liner is. So a lagoon liner is made out of HDPE. It's a heavy duty HDPE, typically. There are higher level ones too, but when we're talking about something like a swine lagoon, we're talking about HDPE, black plastic looking, rubbery looking material that is laid down and secured in the bottom of a lagoon, which doesn't guarantee you won't have any migration, but it substantially reduces the likelihood of the migration. And then the risk is further reduced by having monitoring wells around the lagoon, so that if you see a migration of pollution, you can step in and do something about it. In Oklahoma, where I first started working on swine farms, the groundwater is way far away, very, very deep. But still, we require lagoon liners and monitoring wells, and still we see water pollution. So when I first started working in North Carolina and I saw these unlined lagoons built into the water table, so there's not, a big separation between the bottom of those lagoons. They're connected to each other, That's a significant, obvious problem. So in Washington, there's a push. There's an upcoming permitting hearing, and there'll be a push for better standards. But there are very obvious disproportionate impacts happening, not just in Yakima County, but in other parts of the state as well, that we're trying to get them to take seriously. The court directed them to look at those issues seriously, so we'll see what happens. It's worth watching to see how they handle it. Another example is that I wanted to mention, and I may be going too long, so I'll try to speak quickly. No? Okay. So in Northeast Oklahoma, where I mentioned before, there's this huge concentration of poultry. It's moved across the border into Oklahoma, but there's this one watershed in Oklahoma. It's called Spring Creek, that is within the boundaries of the Cherokee Nation. And it's called Spring Creek because it's fed by springs. And it is, a stream that has been used as a reference stream for the state of Oklahoma because it's so not impacted. And then all of a sudden, in 2018, the poultry industry, one company in particular, started getting permits for contract facilities, massive contract facilities. These CAFOs, a large CAFO starts at 125,000 birds. This was lots and lots of poultry CAFOs with 300,000 or more birds. Inside the boundaries of this tiny watershed, which, you know, was the reference stream for the state of Oklahoma, where a lot of low income and Native American people live. It's a treasured watershed for the state of Oklahoma. It's deeply connected to the community there. And there was, you know, no notice given to them before they moved in. They just started appearing. There was no process. There was no hearing. The state and their legislators, some of their legislators showed up and said, "Oh boy, there's nothing, no authority that we have to address this. You know, we can only register them. We can't address their pollution, despite the fact that the law says these facilities can't pollute and need to have plans in place to ensure they don't discharge." Right? They told people this. They said, let's have a big task force, and your representatives can come and talk with the industry and the regulators, and we'll figure out how to make things better, which has the effect of taking the energy out of the group. And then the process does not deliver any change, which also takes the heart out of the group. You know what I mean? And so, you know, we worked with that community there to start doing water quality sampling. We already see increasing algal blooms, higher levels of phosphorus, and very high levels of pathogens in this watershed that has long been as close to a pristine watershed as you're likely to find anywhere, really, a beautiful one. So, you know, there are lawsuits pending, and you know, who knows how that will turn out. But the other thing I wanted to mention for communities is these facilities coming into your community create division within your community too. And so that's a thing to watch out for, you know, when there's an influx of these facilities in their community. There's division for a number of reasons, which I can't go into really, but it's something that has to be thought through in advance. You know, how are we going to stick together? How are we going to take care of each other's interests? Are we going to learn about each other's interests and impacts and stick together to try to work for change? When people do that, I think are able to do that, they're much more likely to be successful in pushing back for change. So I'll stop there.
I think that echoes well Sherry's point to the economic impacts of fighting local CAFOs as well, right? It highlights how complicated these issues can be within the same community that's being affected in the same way. Absolutely. Alexis and Sherry, did you have anything to add about national trends that you are seeing with CAFOs, the way that they're being addressed, the way that communities are handling them, the impacts on communities nationally?
I think Kelly did a really good job. There was a recent article that I saw, I believe it's in Wisconsin, that some communities have been able to get local zoning laws or ordinances passed that would prevent an industry from growing in their community. But those kinds of successes are few and far between. Again, the industry has such an influence over most of what happens locally. And the reason they do oftentimes is because they sell their presence in the community as economic development, which is a wonderful sound to local elected officials, to economic development directors and that kind of thing. But if you dig deeply, you realize that there isn't really any economic development if you also consider the adverse impact on the local communities, whether it be access to healthcare or the additional need for healthcare or lack of health insurance by many of these families and needing to go to the local hospital if one exists. And in many of these communities, because of other factors, local hospitals no longer exist. So it may be a trip that takes a family outside of a community somewhere to get those kinds of services. So I see the need to start pushing back on that false narrative of economic development as being a positive thing from many of these industries. We have an industry that just came into our county that touted, or the economic development director touted economic development tax base as the rationale for bringing them here. They are suggesting that they will have 75 jobs developed over 5 years. That's 15 jobs a year. And some of them will probably be temporary jobs, but no one seems to ask those questions, or if they do, they don't bother to share with the community. And of course, another situation, as Kelly was talking about, where the community was not notified until they saw the announcement that this unwanted industry was moving into the community, and now, you know, trying to fight back against something that's pretty much a done deal at this point.
And I'll just add, with respect to nationwide trends, there are studies showing disparate harm on the basis of race and income from CAFOs in Mississippi, Ohio, Maryland. I've heard anecdotal reports in many other states, and I think really why you don't see more of that is a lack of research, not a lack of the harm. The study I mentioned involving California's Central Valley was the first study I'm aware of involving disparate harm in the Central Valley, but certainly that's something that people have known anecdotally and recognized in their own community for some time. It can be difficult to do those studies because CAFO locations can be very difficult to find. So even where you suspect disparate harm on the basis of race, you can't always actually locate every CAFO and compare them to census tracts and write a paper about what you're finding. But those trends certainly exist.
That actually leads very well into a question that we've received from the audience. Isn't a first step identifying impacted communities? Are you in favor of a national registry of the sites of each CAFO facility? And if so, what would an ideal registry look like? What barriers to this do you think exist? You want to kick that one off, Alexis?
Well, I think maybe the first step before thinking about what could be done differently with CAFOs is thinking about what could be done with CAFOs that's the same as how we treat every other industry. So creating a national registry is one thing. Making sure that industrial facilities that discharge water pollutions have permits to do that is another. And it's really evidence of how differently we treat CAFOs and how reluctant policymakers are to hold CAFOs to account at all, that they're falling below the standard seen with other industries. So if CAFOs had Clean Water Act permits, it would be a lot easier to know where they are.
I mentioned earlier that there was an information collection request that the EPA was supposed to do. It was aimed at that very topic. You know, where are they located? Basic information about them. So, you know, for people who are interested in knowing about where these CAFOs are in their communities, there is some information available through the EPA. Some of them are registered or have done some sort of reporting. In many states, there are maps available from the state agencies, particularly for swine and dairy and egg production. Poultry CAFOs are a whole different issue. Some places you might find some mapping, but probably not. A lot of those are heavily under-regulated, even at the state level when there are state laws that require it. So yes to a national registry, but echoing what Alexis says, that should be based on, you know, the fact that they are being regulated. and they should have monitoring and reporting that's also available with their location, just like every other industry that discharges pollution.
Sherry, do you have thoughts?
I agree with the other two guests. I would say yes to a national registry, but I'll give you, and most agencies, if they are permitting, should have that information readily available, or there should be a mapping tool somewhere. But I'll give you one example here recently that we learned. There was a swine CAFO that had not been in operation for a number of years. And the residents started smelling what smelled like a swine CAFO in their community, and come to find out that that operation had reinvigorated itself and was now, had hogs on the farm again. And when the community questioned how they could do that, since they've been out of operation for so many years, the answer from the state agency was, well, as long as they have the permit and they keep it active, they can do whatever they want to do. So, here was a place that you would have thought, because that operation was out. So while it is a good idea to try to see and get those permits and get that information, there could also be problems with the accuracy of some of that information that might be available too.
So it sounds to me like we have a lot of the infrastructure built already, but it's a matter of identifying, permitting, and then enforcing. Is that a way to summarize that up?
Yeah.
Yeah, and there are obvious improvements that need to be made to the systems, but that would be an excellent start.
Would be a good start. Okay. We had another question come in. If an agency does an EPA EJ analysis in their NEPA environmental assessment for contracting a CAFO and finds an EJ population is, quote, present but not affected, end quote, what do you look at in their EPA EJ analysis to challenge the agency's determination that the population is not affected? So if you have a NEPA analysis that comes back and says there's no effect on an EJ community here, what do you look to challenge that assessment?
Do you want to go, Alexis, or you want me to try? Go ahead. Okay. So, it depends on the stage, right? If you're commenting on a draft NEPA analysis, then I think that there are tools out there that you could use to gather evidence to submit into the record in the form of comments to the agencies for them to consider. I'm thinking something like EJ Screen, a tool that's available through the EPA, might be very helpful for collecting that information. It's a kind of a difficult question to answer in the abstract. And obviously we can't give legal advice, but there are, I think if it's at that draft stage, putting evidence in the record is the best, is a really important thing to do when it's in the proposed stage. Hope that answered the question.
Alexis and Sherry, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's the best answer.
Okay. A question from the audience. How can I find out if a CAFO is near me? So we talked a little bit about mapping tools. How can people locate those mapping tools in their area?
Well, once again, EJ Screen might be a good start. Many states now have their own mapping tools. I know here in North Carolina, it's in well, there are actually two mapping tools. There is the mapping tool within the Department of Environmental Quality that's based on the permits and some census data. And then there is a tool in the Department of Health and Human Services that looks more at the health data. Those two tools haven't been merged yet. I would hope that at some point the state decides to merge those into one instead of having two separate tools that folks have to go to find out different kinds of information. But mapping tools would probably be the best, or searching the database of permits if you have some sense of where that facility might be.
Google Earth is a good tool as well.
Yeah, it's true.
You can see them from the air. You know, if it's a poultry barn, it's the longer barns, typically no lagoons. A hog farm or a dairy is typically going to have shorter barns and one or more lagoons that you can see from the air. So, you know, you can put your address in and fly around and see what you see.
It's also one of those things that once you understand what a CAFO looks like, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
Alexis, do you have anything to add? No? All right. Is there a way to stop facilities from getting permits in the first place? So if we know they're coming into a community, is there a way that we can prevent them from obtaining a permit?
It's really hard.
Yeah.
It's happened. And it depends. So it depends on where you are and what they're doing. You know, if the state is giving notice, if you have the resources and opportunity to participate in a hearing challenging it, if you can organize in your community and get public opposition, convince the agency and other decision makers, you know, about what the adverse impacts are, it's definitely happened. It's very challenging though. And one of the things that I think, you know, struck that community in Spring Creek in Oklahoma that I talked to you about is, you know, the reality that once they're there, they're probably going to stay, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's important, if you're concerned about a CAFO and the impacts that it's going to have around you, to get involved early and try to find resources that can help. And there are resources out there that can help early in the process.
Another question. Oh, I'm sorry, Sherry, please go ahead.
No, I was going to say it is difficult to stop or keep a permit from being, given to an entity, especially when the agency is not inclined to deny a permit application that's submitted. Public participation processes don't necessarily work. Because too often communities see it not working, and at some point they just stop showing up because they know that the permitting agency is not going to listen. And oftentimes the agencies aren't listening because they're disincentivized to do anything, because the legislature may have decided because of the control or the influence of the industry that every time the agency tries to do a good thing, the legislature has the ability to cut a budget, so that you find yourself with less staff and less ability to regulate or to oversee the permits that you already have. So there are a lot of different things that are going on in that permitting process outside of just the permitting process itself.
Alexis, anything to add to that?
No, those are good answers. I think the zoning rules and permitting requirements vary a lot depending on where you are and what kind of CAFO you're dealing with and where you are in the process. And as Kelly mentioned, there are organizations that help people who are trying to navigate those different requirements. So help is available if you look, but it is an uphill battle even to make sure that a new facility is going to be properly permitted.
We had a question come in about legal resources. Do you all have any specific legal resources that you can offer audience members if they're facing this in their own communities?
What do you think is meant by that? What type of legal resources? Like research or?
So the question specifically refers to legal tools. I personally interpreted it as attorneys to help with the situation. And I think that that was kind of a selfish way of me getting a plug in for the Chesapeake Legal Alliance, because we, as an organization, offer pro bono legal resources to people and organizations throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So North Carolina falls outside of the watershed. That wouldn't be our bailiwick. That would be where we would be able to offer help. But if these issues are arising within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, then CLA would be a good legal resource for community members to contact in order for us to at least start them. If we can't help, we can at least put them in touch with other resources that we think might be able to help those community members. So that's my selfish plug for CLA. Kelly, Alexis, and Sherry, do you have any local legal resources that you have utilized, or organizations that you know of or that you work for that can help communities in the same way?
Well, there are a couple of organizations in North Carolina that have been involved in some of the CAFO litigation, and one is the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, who has a state office here, but they're obviously connected with the national organization. And then the Southern Environmental Law Center, who has offices in several states, has also been involved in working in community. But for local communities looking for legal services, obviously it would need to be a nonprofit or someplace that would provide the services pro bono, because that's one of the big problems. Communities don't have the resources to take on big ag when these issues come along. So being able to identify those kinds of resources are very important, and where they are.
When there are some national organizations that Alexis may be familiar with that work with communities in dealing with those situations. Regionally, there are other entities like SELC that will often be available to work with communities. Like, for example, the Western Environmental Law Center, I hope I got their name right, helped us with the Washington State litigation. And those law clinics are often available to help with that. To get connected with Waterkeeper Alliance, you would typically go through, we work where we have water keepers, river keepers, bay keepers, lake keepers, shore keepers, those kinds of folk. And so, if you were to get in touch, if you have a river keeper where you are, you could reach out through them and see if help is available and connect with us. And then you can also connect directly with us as well. We work with a lot of national organizations on these issues too. I would say for one of the best resources that is not legal per se, but is really important, is the Socially Responsible Agriculture Project. If I was in a community, that'd be one of the first calls I would make to see what resources and expertise they have available to bring to bear to the situation. But there's so many wonderful groups. Alexis, can you kind of go further? Or?
Totally agree. And these are such great groups. Earth Justice is a national environmental law organization. We always represent clients without charge. But candidly, we get many more questions and concerns about CAFOs than we're able to take on. I frequently represent or request that people get in touch with their local riverkeeper. I frequently refer people to SRAP, which does fantastic work. We're happy, to help where we can and share information. We have a lot of compiled studies about CAFOs that I hope are useful to people. But finding these local nonprofit environmental law organizations is a great idea, working with scientific experts and, as Sherry recommended, graduate students and law school clinics. There are resources available to people who have questions.
And there are also sometimes lawyers who care about a particular resource in your area that will just take it on pro bono. All you have to do is knock on a lot of doors to find them.
Sherry, this question is specifically for you. NEJAC is holding an engagement call next week, asking for input on how EPA should invest to address environmental justice. What would you say are the top priorities for frontline communities impacted by CAFO pollution?
monitoring is a huge issue for local communities. Data collection is a huge issue for local communities. Access to all kinds of information that will be helpful to the community. I think several people on here talked about the purchases that folks make of bottled water. That's sort of not a unique situation, and many times folks are buying the bottled water even when they are on local municipal water systems because they don't trust it because of their location or co-location, with many of these facilities. So I think that all of those things play into the perception in local communities. And so education is a huge part of what needs to happen. But I think at the top of the list has got to be money. There is far, far too little money put into this with all of the information that we have. And I think there's too little will. I think that some of the federal agencies are actually risk averse when it comes to doing the right thing for these communities. So I would challenge these communities to get out of that bubble that they're in and start doing the work that they should be doing at the federal level to protect communities on the local level.
Thank you. I am cognizant that we have 2 minutes left, and I would love to leave the discussion on a positive note. We've talked a lot about the terrible impacts that CAFOs have on overburdened communities. Are you seeing any positive trends? Is there hope in either the political process and or the permitting and enforcement process? What can we take away on a hopeful note as we wrap up this conversation this afternoon?
For me, this is a hopeful note. I know last year that some concerned organizations submitted a petition to EPA to make methane a criteria pollutant under the Clean Air Act because it is not now. And methane is a huge problem with CAFOs. I would love to see that happen sooner rather than later. And it gives me hope that there are people across the country that are looking at this issue, looking at current laws that are on the books, regulations that are on the books, and at least trying to make changes at the federal level so that things for people in places like where I live can get better over time.
Kelly or Alexis?
My positive note is that last month, EPA released an environmental justice plan that acknowledged the harm CAFO caused and acknowledged the serious problem of underpermitting. And I think that is an important first step to recognize that this is an issue that there's a failure to comply with and implement and enforce federal laws. And then the next step is identifying the solution and actually adopting it. The first step is important.
Kelly, do you have a positive note?
Yeah, I would say that I have seen an increase in public awareness about the concerns with CAFOs over time. I think that continues to expand, and as more people understand what they are, where their food is coming from, and how that is externalizing all of this harm onto other people, that we will have a greater chance of sort of shifting towards shifting away from allowing them to operate without any meaningful environmental controls. I think that is important for the public to be engaged and tell the regulators that they want this addressed. So that gives me hope that there is increasing, understanding of the issues. And then there's also, a large movement towards, I hesitate to use the term, but, regenerative agriculture, thinking about how we produce our food and how we want to produce it long term, such that we're able to continue, feeding ourselves without causing harm to anyone around us or any resources around us. So I see those discussions happening. So that makes me hopeful as well.
My positive note is that the three of you were willing to take the time out of your very busy schedules and spend 90 minutes talking about these issues with us. We had an audience of, at one point, almost 300 people. So this is a topic that people are interested in learning about, and thank you all so much for joining us. I know that we didn't get to all of the questions, both planned and the ones that came in from the audience. I have them all, so I will be distributing them to our panelists. And if we are, we'll work with ELI to figure out how to get that information out to our attendees. But Sherry, Kelly, and Alexis, thank you all so much for your time and your knowledge on CAFOs and their impact on environmental justice communities this afternoon. Chandler, I'm going to hand it back over to you to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Molly. I just want to echo those sentiments that thank you so much for our audience joining us today and for your many, many thought-provoking questions. We hope you'll continue to watch this space in the years ahead, and I love ending on a positive note, and I hope there's much more positive news on this one in the future. An enormous thank you to our outstanding panelists, Sherry, Kelly, Molly, and Alexis. Just so appreciate your time. Thank you all so much. Please take care and stay safe, and I hope we can have another conversation soon. Thank you all.